The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
The Tea Party movement may be the spark needed to mobilize conservative voters and propel the Republican Party to a House majority. Yet this same force may be turning off other voters and making the battle for control over the U.S. Senate more difficult. Has the Tea Party thrown a reeling Democratic Party a lifeline, or will the Republican Party ride this wave to congressional control? We'll discuss who will be partying in November, next, during office hours. I'm Ken Goldstein, professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The Tea Party has energized frustrated voters. Will this group have a real impact on the upcoming elections? Will they have a lasting influence on the political landscape? Or will they fade from the public eye? Joining me to discuss these questions, John Coleman, the chair of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Political Science Department, and my boss, and an expert on political parties and civic engagement. John, welcome to Office Hours.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming by. Let me start by asking you, I guess, a pretty basic question. We hear the term Tea Party, Tea Party, Tea Party. It's the lead on every network newscast, in the newspapers. People throw the term around. What do we actually mean when we're saying Tea Party? What is this thing which we call the Tea Party?
Well, one thing it is not is a political party. So it is not a party in the traditional sense. It really is a political movement. And there are some parallels, and we can talk about those later, but it's a very, I would say, unorganized movement. It does have some national organizations that claim to be sort of representatives of the movement, but really there's not a sense of hierarchy in it so much. These organizations, there's a Tea Party Federation, the Tea Party Patriots, and Tea Party Express, a few others that have established themselves saying that they are the kind of organizer, the umbrella group for the Tea Party. And it's a sign of the fact that it isn't a highly organized movement in that sense, that we have multiple competing movements or organizations. So it really is very much a ground-up organization. It's sprouted in local areas around the country, and it's gelled a bit more at the national level now. But it was something that we started to see early in mid-2009, where these groups, protests, and so on sprang up. They didn't even know they were the Tea Party at that time. And then later, as people were trying to get a handle on what is this exactly, that name came along, and these various groups sort of used that name to describe themselves. So it's not an organization, certainly in the traditional sense that we would think of a lobbying organization or even an advocacy group of some kind. But it is really a collection of groups and a collection of citizens from around the country at this point.
A little bit later in the show, we're going to talk about Tea Party involvement in primaries. But when we read in the paper that, Tea Party got behind a particular candidate or propelled a particular candidate to victory, what do we mean? Who did what?
Yes, it's a great question. And what we typically mean is there was some combination of people locally who have identified themselves as being organizers in the Tea Party movement, who got behind a candidate, and usually some in particular races, some national figures as well, whether it's Sarah Palin or other folks, who have endorsed a particular candidate in a race. But what it means, I think, really even more than those things, is that the energy of the grassroots citizens that have been involved in going to rallies and protests and so on seems to have swung behind one candidate or another. It's a little hard to measure this, frankly, because we don't have, even if you had a list of groups that are endorsing a candidate, it's not clear how many people each of these groups represent and so forth. So it tends to be some combination of the three. And when you get this trifecta of a local group, nationally significant politicians like a Sarah Palin or a Jim DeMint, and then a sense that there is a kind of groundswell among local activists, local people who have been enthused about the Tea Party movement, at that point you start to say this candidate's been endorsed by the Tea Party. Prior to that, it's a candidate that's been endorsed by an organization, or a candidate that's been endorsed by Sarah Palin, or a candidate that has some activists involved. But it's sort of all three of those together. Then we say this party has the blessing of the Tea Party.
As you were talking, I was thinking it's almost like a weather report when you have a couple of these forces come together and you get this perfect storm, and it takes all three to ignite that, and it doesn't happen everywhere.
Right, it's a great analogy, and it doesn't happen everywhere. And where candidates come from, maybe from people in any of these organizations, or maybe from a Sarah Palin or a Jim DeMint or other folks encouraging people to run, or somebody may simply emerge out of one of these groups. And we have some examples of people who, in a sense, no one ever heard of before, suddenly becoming household names in some of these areas, and some of them really riding the wave of enthusiasm of the activists.
So it's not a coherent organization, although as we talked about, and we'll talk about more, it can be very effective in certain instances. Is it a coherent ideology?
It is, I would say it is. I would say what's linking together the Tea Party is a sense of federal government intrusiveness and scale, that the government has become too intrusive and too large. And I think if you look across issues, that tends to unite most of them. Now, do they have a lot of agreement on specific, very detailed issues? Well, there, not so much. Let's keep in mind, this is a movement that started 18 months ago. So they haven't had a long time to sort of go into think tanks and germinate the policy ideas that they all agree on. It's happened right in the course of the campaign.
So they're angry at current federal policy.
Exactly. But I think there's a general philosophical link to folks in this movement, that they do believe that government has gotten too expansive, and they see the last 2 years as being their example of that. When you get to particular detailed policies, not really, but in that sense, they're like a lot of movements. You think of the environmental movement or the women's movement or even civil rights. A lot of these started out with some general ideas, and then the policy details got worked out along the way, and there might have been a lot of disagreement on some of the policies as well.
Great. John, thank you. We're going to come back, and I want to talk more about who exactly is the Tea Party and how they might differ from other partisans in the United States. Please stay with us in Office Hours. John Coleman from the Department of Political Science, and we're discussing the Tea Party and the 2010 elections.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Where others saw lumber, we recognized a treasure. Where others saw the night, we chose the stars. Where others saw pieces, we unlocked the puzzle that could mean the end of paralysis and cancer. Since 1848, thinkers and achievers at Wisconsin have fearlessly sought ideas that transform the world. Keep on, Wisconsin. Keep on.
Welcome back to Office Hours. Joining me today is John Coleman, Chair of the Political Science Department here at UW-Madison, and we're discussing Tea Party politics in the 2010 elections. John, let me read you a quote by Haley Barbour, Governor of Mississippi, former head of the RNC, perhaps potential Republican presidential candidate in 2012. He said, replace Tea Party with Republican in every instance above, and each description will remain totally accurate. So he was talking about a description of the Tea Party and what they think about particular issues, and he's basically saying, just, put Republican in there and it's the same deal. Is that true?
Well, he's mostly right, I would say. When you look at surveys that have been done and people break down Tea Party versus Republicans, Tea Party followers are certainly more conservative than the average Republican. There's no doubt about that. And they are miles away from the Democrats, no doubt about that either. But that isn't to say that every Tea Party activist and follower is a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. I think this has really brought out of the public some folks who have been disengaged from politics, who maybe they thought of themselves as Republicans, but frankly thought of themselves more as part of the party of non-voters and the party of people who had lost any faith in the system at all. And for whatever reason, they're activated by this particular movement and moment, and they've come back. I don't know that they would consider themselves to be traditional Republicans in the sense of always voting Republican, though probably they do. Most people that think they're independent tend to be pretty predictably partisan. But I do think that it's a little bit different, and what we've really seen that is obviously in the disputes in terms of candidates, where we have the national Republican Party or the state parties endorsing particular candidates, and the Tea Party folks saying, no, not conservative enough. So there is an ideological difference, but Haley Barbour's right in the sense that you don't have many longtime Democrats in the Tea Party movement, that's for sure.
It's a really interesting question. Do we know the answer? Whether we've all read about this enthusiasm gap that's driving the current Republican lead. Republicans, conservatives are just more interested, intense, more likely to vote in 2010. Were these people sitting on the sidelines in 2008 and 2006, and are they coming back in? Or are they what young voters were for Obama in 2008?
Right.
Do we know anything about that, or is that really uncharted waters?
It's a bit of uncharted water, but we can look back and certainly look through political science research, and we know that this happens, right? Every time there's a big win in a presidential election, That's called the surge, and then you have the decline. And almost inevitably, the president's party loses enthusiasm over those first 2 years, and the opposition party rises up and does pretty well in the midterm election. So the Republicans likely would have done okay this year, even in the absence of the Tea Party movement. But I think what the Tea Party gives is maybe a bit more certainty and confidence that the Republicans will do well, and probably has pushed some of their candidates in a more conservative direction than they would have been likely to do on their own. The party would have done okay, I think, in 2010. We would have had an enthusiasm gap to some degree, I think, anyway, with the two parties. But the Tea Party certainly has elevated that enthusiasm gap. And on the Democratic side, you have folks who are dispirited, some who actually disagree with what the Democrats have done, thinking it is too aggressive, and then other Democrats feeling not nearly aggressive enough, you've compromised and caved in too much. So we have that mix on that side. The Republican side, enthusiasm is across the board. I think Tea Party is a big reason why that's true.
Before we continue on our discussion of current politics, which we could do forever, speak back to me about what some historical precedents are for the Tea Party. You mentioned earlier on that that is something that happens in American politics. One, you talked about the ebb and flow, but also these social movements coming up. What were other social movements? What happened to them?
Right. Let me give you the ones that I think are the best parallels in our recent history. And I mentioned three already. And parallels in the sense of large movements that it would be hard to say there's any one leading organization, for example, but eventually they do develop some that people refer to as defining the movement. So with civil rights, you get the NAACP, for example, which had already existed but became a sort of dominant, even more noted organization. The now National Organization for Women and the Women's Movement. With the environmentalists, the Sierra Club, and other groups and so forth, have become sort of thought of as the leading edge of those movements. But it took a while for that to be clear and to sort out. And I think the Tea Party is in that early stage that these movements were in too. It's not clear who's up, who's down, who will ultimately emerge. Now, one way that the Tea Party is, I think, quite interestingly different from those
John,
movements.
let me have you hold that thought. We're going to kick to a break here and come back and let you finish up that thought on the historical precedents. Please stay with us on Office Hours. Tea Party Politics 2010. Welcome back to Office Hours with John Coleman, Chair of the Department of Political Science here at UW-Madison. So John, I interrupted you there. Let me let you finish your thought about other previous historical social movements in the United States.
I talked about the women's movement, civil rights, and environmental movement, some organizational issues that you could compare the Tea Party to. One way in which they're very different is those three movements could be successful through the courts, through filing cases. They didn't always have to be winning elections. The Tea Party, it's much harder to imagine how a court strategy works with the Tea Party. You can't go in as a taxpayer and file a lawsuit against the government because you don't like how they're spending your money. That's just not it's not a way that you can proceed. So I think they'll have less of a legal court option in the Tea Party, and they really have to work through the electoral system, even more so than those other movements did. So I think there we have an important difference. Now, one other parallel I'll make just quickly is with the Democratic reformers in the 1960s and 70s. The Democratic Party had this huge internal split. And you had folks who felt left out, who felt the party had moved too far in some ways to the right, certainly in foreign policy, and big splits on the war, and that you couldn't get insurgent kind of liberal candidates in. Democratic Party had a big blow-up in the late 60s, early 70s.
A lot of that leadership coming from University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Absolutely, and you have this reform that's instituted, and you get a candidate like George McGovern, who many Democrats around the country, organized labor, wouldn't even endorse him, viewing him as just too far out on the fringe and so on. But you've seen this kind of sense in the Democratic Party too, of the folks feeling that the elites, the moderate folks in the party, the people who just want to go along to get along, who are happy with power, have taken over too much, and we, the folks who have the ideological ideas, don't have as much influence as we want. And we see that now with the Tea Party as well.
So that's a really interesting point. We talked about how the Republican Party is trying to harness the energy of the Tea Party without dealing with some of the negative consequences of that.
Right.
But you mentioned that unlike women's movement, environmental movement, or the civil rights movement, Tea Party can't really follow a legal strategy. They got to win elections.
Yeah, right.
But it depends what we mean by win. They can win a bunch of primaries, but do they then have to win general elections? Mm-hmm. And we can talk about whether the Tea Party energy has put the best Republican or best conservative forward in many of these contests. They don't seem to be caring about that if elections is what they need to win. They're not making that strategic calculation.
I don't think that they are completely. The mood seems to be, we need to get the party to move in the right direction. And we may not do it all in this election. It may take 2 or 3 elections. If we get a Christine O'Donnell in to replace a Mike Castle, who we think is far too liberal and has voted the wrong way on too many issues, if we lose that, that's the price that we pay for losing, but at least we don't have him in, and there's no point of having a liberal Republican or a moderate Republican in. And that seems to be the dominant mindset right now. So in that sense, you do have this struggle, and it's exactly the way you put it. The party loves the enthusiasm of these folks, just like the Democrats in the 60s and 70s loved the enthusiasm of the anti-war folks and all of that. But they're a little concerned about what kind of people are you going to try to nominate and get into office, because we have to win elections after all. So we're really in that struggle right now, and I think my sense is Tea Party activists are fine with losing elections if they've pushed the Republican Party in the right direction, and that's ultimately their goal, is to push the party in the right direction.
It's going to be very interesting on November 3rd, after what the spin's going to be and what the election bar is for them. If Harry Reid ends up winning in Nevada, beating Sharon Engel. Most people thought he was a dead man walking if the Republicans had nominated someone else. Most people assume that the Republicans are going to lose the Delaware seat, which would almost been a sure victory. Do people then turn on the Tea Party after that within the Republican establishment? Are they then thought of as more important, more credible, or if they have to follow an election strategy, is that a loss?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there will be some backbiting, if you will, and some denunciations of the Tea Party movement for costing us our chance to have even more victories. But ultimately, if we're only talking 1 or 2 victories, even in the case of the Senate, I think if the Republicans are up to 48 or 49 seats, the party will say, we would have loved to have that 50th seat or 51st seat, no doubt about that. But on the other hand, I think what the balance will be is the Tea Party had at least something to do with us getting up to 45, 46, 47, 48, and we can complain about their effect on that last marginal one that we lost, or do we want to say, look at the enthusiasm, money, organization, and so on that they brought in that may not have ultimately caused those other folks to win, but certainly didn't hurt and may have helped in some way.
Great. Stay with us on Office Hours. We'll continue our discussion of Tea Party politics 2010.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours, where we're talking Tea Party politics in election 2010 with John Coleman, chair of the Department of Political Science at UW-Madison. So on September 14th, which was the last set of primaries here, and Christine O'Donnell wins in Delaware, Karl Rove despondent, the White House popping champagne corks, because they thought, wow, now we have someone we can direct our fire on, try and nationalize these elections, make the Tea Party a target.
Right.
Why were they happy? Is that potentially effective?
Well, they're happy for 2 reasons there. One is they don't think that she has much chance of winning that seat, and Karl Rove didn't either, for that matter. And they did think that Castle would win. And so that was, most folks are assuming that Castle would win. So some of the projections have gone from a 95% probability of Republicans winning that seat to a 95% probability of them losing it now. So that's one reason that the White House was happy. The other is that anytime you get a movement like this, there's always the potential, and not just the potential, but the likelihood that you're going to find odd statements that someone has made or just something strange, and you'll try to tie that around and link that to everyone else in that party or that organization and so on. And so there's been some things about Christine O'Donnell that have gotten some attention. So the question is, do you try to take those things, or things that Sharon Engel and other people have said, do you try to take those and really spread them out and make them national issues? And in a sense, a broad brush that if you're in a group with people who say things like that, do you want to trust people who are in that group? So that's the question now that the Democrats are trying to figure out. Do we want to nationalize? Or the typical strategy in a year like this is to say, you don't nationalize, you localize. You have your local incumbents explain how good they've been to the district and how well they've represented and all the services that they've done. And you don't have your representative in Ohio or Indiana or in Nevada trying to explain or trying to talk about somebody from across the country and some odd thing that they said. You talk about What do they do to make schools better here? What do they do to help the roads? What do they do to help your family when they're in need, and so on? That's the traditional strategy in a difficult election year like this. My guess is that that's ultimately what the party will end up doing, because those incumbents and the candidates I think they really want to localize the races. The White House has some other items on their agenda, obviously, and so for them, the nationalizing strategy may be a little more attractive. But it's hard for me to see how that works in the long run, really. If the nationalizing is simply to point to kind of odd, what you characterize as odd candidates here and there, someone in Massachusetts or Washington or Florida, do they really care who the candidate is out across the country that's saying some odd thing? I'm not so sure they do.
We got about a minute left, John. In 5 years and 10 years, are we talking about a Tea Party movement? They seem to be more than simply the demographic moniker of this year, more than soccer moms of 2010.
I think that's right.
What do you think's going to happen?
Well, we'll be talking about the Tea Party movement. I don't know if it'll still be called that in 10 years. But what we'll say in 10 years is there was a conservative ascendancy within the Republican Party that tried to redo what they thought Ronald Reagan and conservatives did 20 years, 30 years earlier. And we'll look back and either say they were successful and they pushed the party more in a conservative direction, or they didn't. Did the sort of the moderates in the party push back and they didn't move? But I don't think we'll be talking about an independent organization. We'll be talking about, did they move the Republican Party in the ideological direction they wanted, as happened 30 years ago with Ronald Reagan and that conservative movement.
So they're either going to swallow the party or the party will swallow them? Those are really the two options?
Those are the options, right?
Great, super. John, thanks for joining us.
Ken, thanks for having me.
Tea Party politics in 2010, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Don't forget, Office Hours is on the web via our university website, Facebook, or even Twitter. Take a look and let us know your thoughts. From the University of Wisconsin-Madison, this has been Office Hours. Thanks for stopping by.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.